And welcome to Boundless Festival's Unwrapping the Muslim Writer. I'd like to start by acknowledging the First Nation storytellers and the traditional owners of the land I'm broadcasting from, which is the Bidjigal people, and pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging, and recognize their continuing connection to land, waters, and culture. So we have a lot of really interesting points to get through, and I want to give the speakers the opportunity to introduce themselves first. So Bilal, I think we'll start with you. If you can please introduce yourself, say what country you're on, and also tell me how you stayed sane in lockdown.
Oh my gosh, hello amazing people. Thank you all so much for coming. I want to start off by acknowledging that today I am working on Darug land. So I want to pay my respects to the Barramadigal people, and I want to pay that respect to elders past, present, and emerging on this land that I am getting to work on today. And it's also the land that I live on, so I feel very, very blessed to be here. For all of you whose names I recognize, hello, it's very, very fantastic to have you here. The way that I stayed sane during lockdown is I'm a teacher. And I work a lot with students, and often they describe me as having zero chill and having no chill, which basically means that whenever I have downtime, I kind of just fill it with projects and I don't know how to stop. So my three main projects that I think kept me sane during lockdown was our Bankstown Poetry Slam that I get to run with Sara. It moved online and we started doing in-conversations on Discord. Not too different to what we're doing here, but it was like me getting to have really deep and long conversations about poetry with artists that I adore. So that was one thing. Next thing that got me through was Sara and I started a super secret poetry book club that is invite only. And we've been having conversations about poetry every single week and just being able to talk to friends and fellow artists about the things that I am passionate about and to hear from them about what they're passionate about. And last thing that kept me sane was video games, because I am still a child at heart, and I feel like I just tackled video games as if they were like books I were trying to write. I just played lots of video games. That's
amazing. I actually made the mistake of buying my husband a PS5 for his birthday.
Have you seen him?
I've lost him forever. No. Amani, I'd love to hear from you, please. How you stayed sane lockdown and what country you're on.
Thank you, Sara. I'm zooming from Darug country, and I'm not sure how sane I stayed in lockdown with two kids, a 5-year-old and a 6-year-old. I found it quite challenging to keep them entertained. We were sort of trying to do my daughter's remote learning and stay on top of that while doing our own work, and it was a juggle and a struggle, and I'm glad it's over, to be honest. Whilst a little bit nervous about them going back to school, I'm relieved to be able to get back to my own work and to start working on some new projects.
Good on you. Absolutely amazing. I also became a mum during lockdown, and I just wanted to go to brunch, and I just wanted to go get a pedicure and get out and do things for me. And so I hope that you're indulging in some self-care now that things are open again. Tasnim, I'd love to hear.
Thank you so much for having me. I am currently on Gadigal land, but a lot of my work and life is also on Ngunnawal country, which is incredibly beautiful, and it's such a privilege to be able to tell stories across these countries. How did I stay sane? I actually went down to Canberra for a week to visit my family in June. And I say week, and I got back to Sydney, where I'm normally based, on Monday. So it was quite a lot of time. And the ACT managed to avoid the lockdown for the first maybe 6 weeks or so. And in that time, I was going to the theatre, I was seeing the ballet, like it was bonkers, because everything else was shut down. And then we ended up in lockdown too. And during that, there was just a lot of family time, which is really nice. I have a little 2-year-old niece, and I went from being like the hypothetical auntie in Sydney, as she says, to being like a real auntie in person. So that was really nice. And I spent lots of time outside as well, which I think is hard in the big smoke, but in Canberra, it's mostly just outside. So yeah, that was really nice.
That's great. And congratulations on being promoted from a hypothetical auntie to a real auntie.
It's amazing. I strongly recommend.
That's incredible. Okay, so I think I'd love to dive into the first question, if that's okay. And I just wanted to let all the participants know that we will be taking questions at the end. So if at any point you'd like to ask a question, you can simply put it in the chat, and they're going to be collated, and I'll try and get through as many as possible at the end. Okay, so I personally have always been introduced or described as a Muslim writer, and I've more so felt like a writer who happens to be Muslim rather than a Muslim writer. Our faith obviously informs our ideas, our writing, and the stories we want to tell, but so does every other marker of who we are: our culture, our background, our upbringing, our family, our education, socioeconomic status, etc. So to what extent does your faith inspire your work, and do you identify as a Muslim writer? Tasnim, I'd love to hear from you first.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I guess my background's interesting because mostly I write for performance. So I write for theatre and I do some screenwriting. And so it just depends. I get called a Muslim writer, and that is how I identify. But also I identify as a Canberran writer, and I'm right-handed and bespectacled. Like, I think all of these things to some extent or another have an impact. I think what I think I struggle with more is the idea of me telling Muslim stories. Like, I just don't think that that's the case. I gave a lecture, like a guest lecture at NIDA earlier this year about performance practices. And the first thing that was given to me was like Islamic performance practices. And I'm like, that's not a thing. And I asked for them to change it to Muslims. So it's not about the faith, it's about the people who practice the faith, and we're the ones who do it. So I think that, it's always like an interesting thing to straddle, where people kind of put things on it, and it also has a lot of, I guess, preconceptions that come along with it. So I'm definitely a Muslim writer. Do I write Muslim stories? Not always. It's kind of quite broad, but it's always informed by my faith and my background and my experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. Bilal, to what extent does your faith inspire your work, and do you identify as a Muslim writer?
Every time Tasnim speaks, I just want to be her friend more and more. I totally agree with everything that she's saying. Like, being a Muslim is a part of who I am. It is a part of what makes my identity who I am. And it informs much of what I do in the world and also in my art. But in the same way, I am also an Australian writer, and I am a Lebanese writer, and I am a writer from Bankstown. And I think all of those things are part of my identity, but I am not just one thing. And often what Tasnim was talking about there with saying that I am a Muslim writer, often I think there's a connotation of but then I am purely writing Muslim stories. And I feel like that is not what I do in my work at all. Like, I am not writing about the Muslim experience. I am writing about my experience. And part of that experience happens to be that I am a Muslim. But it is not the whole and summation of my entire experience on this earth. So it is part of it, and I identify with it. And I think there are definitely some connotations attached to it that we might unpack over the course of the session today. But I would love to hear questions from people. If they want to know more about what we're talking about with that stuff, you guys can pop them into chat, and I think Sara will get to ask us those questions later.
Yeah, definitely. And Tasnim and Amani, you're both obviously veiled like I am, and I think that we probably get lumped into that more easily because of the hijab. And so, Amani, I'd love to hear from you as well about your thoughts on this and how your faith inspires your work.
Yeah, I agree with the comments that both Bilal and Tasnim made, and I'd add to them to say that we often try to, we talk about Islam or Islamic things as disembodied from the people who practice Islam. So I think that was a really good point that Tasnim made. Faith is integrated into practice, and for every individual that varies. And so with every story that varies. And that's the whole point of having diverse literature and diverse storytelling, to capture the nuance and complexity of our experiences. And as a writer, I think that's informed my work and my approach. My book, The Mother Wound, came out right at the beginning of lockdown, and is written as a feminist memoir. And the particular feminist perspective I take is one that acknowledges the intersectional experiences that women have and that shape their lives. And one of the important intersections in my life is the fact that I'm a woman, the fact that I'm Muslim. And speaking from lived experience and writing from lived experience meant acknowledging how complex that reality might be. And that meant acknowledging things that are negative that come with that, as well as things that are positive or uplifting that come with that, and everything in between. So I'm not sure, I've never sort of gone out of my way to identify as a Muslim writer, but my religious practice and my relationship with faith is definitely something that I depict in my writing, and I think it's part of my reality and should therefore be there.
Beautifully said, beautifully said. And I'd like to pick up on something that you just said. Do you feel compelled to be a spokesperson for the broader public on behalf of the Muslim community, especially now that you've put out this feminist memoir, and you've spoken quite in a lot of detail in your book about how your faith, informs the way that you live? Amani?
I don't consider myself a spokesperson for anyone. I consider myself an advocate for women's health and safety, and anyone who wants to come along on that journey is welcome to do so. And the more voices we have contributing to that conversation, the better, I think. And I also have really let go of that pressure to somehow speak on behalf of everyone. We're not sort of hired PR agents for any community. And I think in the topic of this panel is related to looking at taboos, and in order to write about taboos, you have to write honestly. And for me, that means depicting my experiences as they occurred, and with a lot of authenticity, and without succumbing to the same shame or pressure or stigmas that have driven or affected me, for example, when I was younger. So I think it's really empowering to let go of that expectation and to write from a place where you're very deliberate and informed, and you're telling a really authentic story.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And that kind of brings me to my next question. So sometimes it can feel quite exhausting to try and be representative of a community and speaking your truth without validating certain stereotypes that people who are not Muslim have about Muslims, which is the famous double bind. So from the outside, we experience Islamophobia, and from within our communities, we may be judged or shunned for speaking out on something. So Bilal, I'll start with you. As a Muslim writer, do you actively seek to write about or avoid certain topics? And if so, what are they?
I've been thinking a lot about this, and I think my answer is like one of the most boring answers I can give, but it is the most genuine answer that I can give as an individual. And it is that I do not actively seek out to talk about any taboo topics. And prior to the kind of writing of the description of what this event is, I hadn't even really considered it, because for me, when I am creating work, and I'm primarily a performance poet, which means I write poetry to be performed to a live audience, the thing that I'm thinking about with writing is how can I genuinely represent, in the same way that Amani's been describing it, my personal experience. And often I'm thinking about my purpose behind why I am doing that. Like, who is my audience and why am I creating this work to share with people? And I'm not trying to share anything to be controversial. I'm not trying to share anything to like make people see the world the way that I see it. Primarily, I write first and foremost for myself, because I wholeheartedly believe that as writers, we write to conceive of the world around us in a more effective way. Like the way we understand the world, at least for me, and hopefully some of you guys can agree with me, is by writing about it. And that's how we can understand our circumstance. So when I am creating work, I am trying to think about how I can create something that has a net positive in the world. How can I create something that helps in understanding and in connection? And that is my only consideration when I create work. And often that could just mean that I've created a poem that made me feel heard about something that I've experienced. It doesn't necessarily have to be that I have, revealed something to people that they didn't understand beforehand. It's enough to be like, I have an audience and now I've got to share this thing. But often as well, the greatest moments of connection I feel is when you can have camaraderie with your audience, where maybe you're describing something that you have felt and they've experienced in a similar manner. And that moment of connection for me is my biggest consideration of a writer. And I think inherently overrules the idea of trying to write about taboo topics, because every topic is a human topic, and that is at the forefront of my mind when I'm creating art.
Yeah, wow. And so you talked about putting something out that's a net positive, and why is that important to you?
I was thinking of that as well. And like, Sara, you'll be able to relate to this, because the first time we met was at the Bankstown Poetry Slam. And I remember the first time that I performed at the slam, I was trying to think about what a successful performance of poetry might look like. And I remember thinking that as an audience member, the thing that made me so drawn towards performance poetry was that often people would come on stage and talk about things that I had never heard anyone else talk about, and I thought only existed in my life and in my world. And when someone is like going to share a poem about how like they have a fight with their brother or something, like, oh my gosh, I have had that exact same fight with my brother. I didn't know that someone else had the same human experience as me. And I felt so fulfilled and so safe in that moment because I could find that connection. And for me, the reason I want to do the net positive thing is because I want to create that opportunity for other people. I want to stand on stage and do the same thing that other amazing artists like Amani, like Tasnim, like yourself, like Yaz Lewis, like the people at the Poetry Slam do every day, where they perform and they tell a story that other people can connect to. So if I'm like going to perform a poem and at least one person in the audience is like, oh yeah, like that happened to me as well, or I feel that as well, then I think I've created a safe and respectful environment for another person. And like, what better thing can we do as human beings?
Eat Nutella.
Oh, very true. That's like second.
Yeah. Clearly I haven't had lunch. Okay, so Tasnim, I'd love to hear your perspective on this. Have you sought to write about certain topics or avoided certain topics in your work? And
I mean, it's a really good question, and it just makes me think of Hasan Minhaj in his like Netflix special talked about this line that his dad said to him, which in Hindi is "Log kya kahenge," which there's a complete like a literal translation in the language I speak, Bengali, which is related, which is what will people say? And I think that's a big one. And I remember that like being really burdensome when I was younger. And then going up to my mum and talking to her about this and about the things that I wanted to talk about and worrying what people would say. And she was like, Tasnim, people are going to talk anyway. Like, you know, and growing up, I feel like, you know, I got good grades. I never had any male friends. I rarely ever went to parties. And then it was still like, oh, you've put on weight, or, oh, you've gotten dark, or, oh, we didn't see you at this. Or so I feel like as I've gotten older, being able to shed a lot of that has been really helpful. And so I think for me, like, I think I really connected with what you were saying, Bilal, in terms of your work, that it's about connection. And that's kind of how I see it. And there are some themes that I find I keep coming back to, which are taboo, I guess. I write a lot about mental health and mental ill health. I spent 4 years working for a mental health organization in my day job. And like I've, you know, worked with Headspace in the past when I was younger. And like, I think it's something that we really need to talk about, knowing people, both Muslim and non-Muslim, who have had mental health issues, who've experienced suicidal ideation. Like, you know, often in our communities, we talk about that as a crisis of faith or having weak faith. But I think we just need to find much more nuanced ways of talking about it. And I think art can open up those conversations. I think I also write a lot about queerness and LGBTI issues, because, you know, I think we don't really talk about sexuality regardless, and we certainly don't about sexual minorities or gender diversity. And, you know, I work in the theatre, which has people from all kinds of, I guess, backgrounds and walks of life. And a lot of my peers are queer, and, you know, there are queer Muslims as well. And often, you know, it's a very different journey for them to what, like, you know, an Anglo-Australian queer person might experience. And I think for me, for people to feel seen and heard and connected with is really, really important in the work that I write. And I think I have the privilege also of being able to put my words in the mouths of actors, by and large. so they can say the things, and I feel like I don't want to be a spokesperson. I'm not interested in that. I want my art to speak. And so I get to give that to other people without judgment and just wanting to talk about these things that are often hard.
Yeah. What do you think is the hardest thing that you've put out there that you've wanted to talk about in your work?
Yeah, I wrote a solo work. I mean, I say I give these words to actors, but every so often I write a piece and then perform it because I straight up forget how awful it is being an actor and how hard it is to remember lines. But I wrote a solo work about being at university, and it was autobiographical, and it was about experiencing untreated generalized anxiety disorder and the impact that it had, and going from like, you know, being invited to do honors to then being put on academic probation, almost being kicked out of school. And like also having feelings for my best friend who was a white guy, lapsed Catholic, potential men's rights activist, terrible, terrible choice. But thankfully, none of that eventuated. But I think some of that stuff, like it's really hard to talk about, but what it gives people in an audience is an opportunity to connect. And an opportunity to hear about things like, oh, when I was 19, I made some terrible decisions also, or when I was 19, I didn't have the language to, you know, talk about my anxiety. And here's this woman on stage who's, you know, reading from her Facebook messages. I mean, the play was better than that, hopefully.
It sounds amazing.
But yeah, like this stuff, I think creating art is an act of vulnerability. And the reason we do that, the reason we make ourselves vulnerable is because that's where we connect. Clearly I've listened to Brené Brown before, but yeah, I think it's really important to be able to do that.
Absolutely, I definitely agree. And Amani, I'd love to hear from you. You've put this huge body of work, this memoir out into the world, and that obviously also took a lot of vulnerability. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on, you know, if you've skipped around certain topics in your book, or did you just kind of like go at it?
So there's this quote from Dr. Judith Herman, who has written this very popular book called Trauma and Recovery that I came across while I was recovering from my own trauma. And she says, shame dies when stories are told in safe places. And I think that's something that both Bilal and Tasnim have really highlighted. And it's something that really drives both my advocacy and my writing. And in order to write, so I lost my mum to domestic violence in 2015. My dad was charged with the murder and eventually convicted. I gave evidence at trial. I read out a victim impact statement. It was a broadly publicized case. There were so many taboos associated with those events, and there was so much shame projected onto myself, my sisters, my family, and also vicariously my community as a result of those events, without anyone ever directly speaking to me about it. So it's very important for me to actively challenge that shame and to turn it around and place it back where it belongs. And a lot of survivors have been writing about that. And I think it's incredibly empowering to be able to reject the way in which shame is weaponized against survivors of violence, especially gender-based violence, because it's what maintains silence. It's what prevents people from accessing support for the mental health consequences that the trauma has for them. It's what prevents women from being able to build solidarity movements. So for me, it's really important to actively challenge taboos, and it's incidental to what I'm writing about, and I can't be shy or embarrassed or hold back about any of those things in reclaiming my narrative. So in my book, there are taboos that are taboos in any context, things like witnessing and experiencing DV within your family, speaking about your parents' relationship, being victimized by violent crime, withholding forgiveness, relying on Centrelink or welfare payments and lining up at the Centrelink, experiencing PTSD, feeling incredibly broken and vulnerable, even things to do with motherhood and the intricacies of labor and breastfeeding, and just women's bodies can be treated as taboo subjects by society. And then within my cultural context, there are additional things that I touch on in my writing, which are you know, being in an intersectarian relationship, racism by Arabs towards non-Arabs of darker skin tones, how you grieve and respond to death can be taboo. Even feminism as a concept can be taboo, depending on how the audience responds or understands what you mean when you're talking about it. and things like internalized Islamophobia that we often struggle with. And then there's taboos that come because I'm writing in the white gaze, and they're to do with the fact that my mum was significantly younger than my dad, that their marriage fits within what we define as an arranged marriage, that I'm a visibly Muslim woman talking about violence and talking about how I've been affected by domestic violence, and even things like my grandmother's experience, which I tell in the story, and how my family's been impacted by Israeli colonization and Israeli violence can be treated as taboo depending on your context. So I think it was, there's no way I could even talk about my life in any meaningful way without challenging taboos and the shame associated with them, and just reclaiming my story for what it is.
Yeah, that was absolutely brilliantly said. And as someone who has, well, not read the book, but I listened to the audiobook, you do definitely delve into each of those things with a lot of distinction and introspection. And it also kind of made me think about my own experiences. And growing up, I was so adamant on proving that I was not one of the evil Muslims, and so I would go out of my way to be quite pleasant to everyone and to smile at people, and to make sure that my monobrow was plucked and I had 2 distinct eyebrows, because I just really, really wanted to set myself apart from this narrative that Muslims fall into some kind of a stereotype or are a certain way. And I think that's really what got me into writing, was this deep-seated desire to connect with other people and to kind of show a bit of myself to the world. So I might ask then a question that I've been thinking about a lot. Who do we write for? And do you care about being misunderstood or misrepresented? Bilal, I'd love to start with you. Who do you write for?
Thank you, Sara. Like I was mentioning before, I think primarily, at least when I first started writing, I was writing for myself. I was writing to be a writer who could use the craft of writing to understand the world around me a little bit better. So there's a running joke in the Bankstown Poetry Slam that every single time I write a poem, it's about a new family member. Which isn't really a joke because I have a very big family. So like I would write a single poem every month and perform it. And I have 6 siblings. So I had like half a year already figured out of what my work was going to look like, because I would just do a new poem about everyone in my family. And it was like that, trying to understand how I navigate those relationships was the first kind of body of work I created, was how do I navigate inside of my family? And then it was kind of really interesting for me to think about how the longer I wrote, that kind of broadened. And then I started writing about like the community that I was living in, because I grew up in Bankstown, and then like Australia in general, and then thinking about the world and my relationship with my mother country, where my parents came from in Lebanon, and all those kind of navigating those relationships. And I remember being asked at an event, and often when you are a performance poet, especially when you were looking for gigs where you want to perform and be paid for your work, many of my first gigs, I was performing to audiences that had very different experiences to me and that looked very different than the way that I look, which meant that I was telling stories that they hadn't often heard before. And then for me, that kind of meant when I was doing that, I would get asked a lot of questions like, how do you navigate the intersectionality between being born in this country and being a child of diaspora? And I'm like, yo, I have no idea what that question even means. Like, you just said words at me and it was nonsense. And for me, the way that I kind of learned about all of that was by writing about it myself. And that's why I think as writers, especially writers from minority backgrounds, one of the things I think is really useful to focus on is that a journey of understanding yourself. And then also doing as a next step, exactly what Amani described, about finding a safe space where you can share those conversations, where I can go, hey, I don't actually know what it means that I can't, as a Muslim Arab man, now safely feel like I can travel in the country of my birth. And I've never thought of that before, but I am going to write about it. And I'm going to write about it for myself, and then I'm going to share it with people that I trust. And I'm going to use that to inform the conversations that I'm having, because I also want to learn from them. And it always comes down to connecting over human experience. So hopefully me kind of making fun of myself and being strange answers that question. But I'd love to hear from other people what they thought.
Yeah, And Tasnim, I'd love to hear from you, like about who you write for, and also has that changed over time?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good question. I started off as a performance poet actually, because I mean, I think a lot of kids of migrant heritage, we end up using that as a route because the barriers to entry are so low. You know, you need words and a microphone and an audience. You can sometimes do without the mic, but like, you know, with writing for theatre now, I worked a lot. I came up through youth theatres, and I was there as a youth and as a mature age young person, as I have described myself. And I think I write for young weirdos. Like the theatre, we seem to attract them, you know, people who kind of never quite fit in at school or in their communities or in their families, who like maybe felt things a bit too deeply and were termed overly sensitive. Like I think, you know, the way that we can connect is so rich when we've got that like audience relationship, which you can certainly get in the printed word, but it's not as immediate and it's not as, I guess, visceral. And so I think I write a lot for people like me. You know, when I worried about that question, what are people going to say? It was always aunties. It was always, you know, people in the community who are much older. And I, you know, my parents don't care what they think. So I feel like I don't have to carry that and I don't have to care what they think. What I do care is what people who have my experiences think. So people who have grown up straddling these two or maybe multiple heritages, who maybe speak multiple languages, who think, you know, in two different ways of being, and each of them, it's not like it's 50% of one and 50% of the other. It's all just part of us. And I think that they're the people I write for. It's often young people and often people who, you know, this is an opportunity where they can connect and find each other and not feel so alone.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. And it's funny that you say, like, you know, the thing that was holding you back was like the aunties, because often
the uncles too. The uncles don't get off scot-free.
No, both of them.
Yeah.
It's really funny, hey, because like normally those issues are more cultural than religious.
For sure.
I think that we're holding back for religious reasons, but really it's like, you know, we just don't want to be the tea that everyone is sipping, so to speak.
I had to block so many people on social media because I'm like, I'm turning into the tea.
Yeah. And so for people who don't know, tea is like young people slang for gossip. So I only found that out like relatively recently. But Urban Dictionary is your friend, if you didn't know that. Amani, I'd love to hear from you as well. Your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so both Bilal and Tasnim's comments resonated with me. I started writing originally for myself. It was part of the therapy that I was doing with the homicide victims support group. My counsellor in one of my very first sessions, while I was very, very traumatized, gave me a journal and said, why don't you write? Because I felt so silenced by shame. I felt really afraid and isolated in my experiences. And the more I wrote, the more I realized that I had things to say and that writing them for myself wasn't satisfying any longer. And I wrote my victim impact statement for my father's trial and then felt the same way again after reading that out. I was like, I've got so much more to say about what's happened, and this is just one page and that's all I get in these proceedings. How do I tell the rest of my mum's story? How do I tell the rest of my own story? And how do I build my craft so that I'm telling it in the best way that I possibly can? And as I started, I spent a lot of time learning and refining my craft, and I picked up 2 bits of knowledge or advice in terms of process that I put on sticky notes, and I had them sticking at the bottom of my screen while I was writing my manuscript. And the first one was the reminder to write like you're dead. So that I wouldn't, you know, my dad's one of 11. So when it comes to aunts and uncles, I've got a stack of them who are not my biggest fans. So I needed to remind myself of my purpose and what I was trying to let go of. And then in the same, I guess, in the same way, who am I writing for? Who do you serve? That was on the sticky note. And I was serving myself, my family, my mum, my grandmother, who both experienced immense injustices and never had their day in court. And then beyond that, I was serving women who can relate to me in any way, whether that's because they're a Muslim woman who hasn't found a space in which sharing their experiences of violence, whether it's interpersonal or state violence, and has never felt empowered to do so. And then more broadly, all survivors and victims of violence who are now finding or beginning to find ways. I think, you know, maybe the conversation is promising in the sense that people are beginning to find ways to share those experiences, and there's more political will for policy responses to actually happen as a result. So for me, there were both personal and political dimensions to my writing practice, and I think that'll always be the case. It is with my art making as well. And I always oscillate between, okay, what was my lived experience? What did that mean to me? How did it affect me? And what does this mean from a policy perspective? How do we change it so that this is not happening to other people? Who else is this impacting? Who's worse off than me? Because I also enjoy certain privileges, and shifting my perspective so that I'm looking both introspectively and outside myself in order to write, and in a way that hopefully is influential and powerful and that people connect with.
Yeah, absolutely. And you did a lot of advocacy. If you want to touch on that as well regarding your recent little win.
Yeah, so that's actually a really good example of how the personal is political. So one of the experiences that I had was when I lost my mum. I was actually 5 months pregnant, and I was relatively young. I was 26 years old, going on 27. And when my daughter was born 5 months later, I was told by Centrelink that I was no longer eligible for paid parental leave because I'd taken too much time off work to deal with bereavement, to rehouse my sisters, to recover from everything that had happened. And I had exceeded the work test, which is the criteria that they use to test your eligibility, by 5 days. I couldn't believe it. And I just thought, I cannot possibly be the first pregnant woman who's had something like this happen, and who's then lost their eligibility. And I couldn't quite let it go. So at first I wrote to the ministers, I wrote to my local member, I argued, I appealed, and eventually when the minister intervened, suddenly my circumstances could be squeezed into one of the existing boxes. But then I thought, hold on, that's just me. I can advocate for myself. I started my career as a commercial lawyer. I've done things like this before. I'm able to understand the legislation to some extent and advocate for myself. But how does that fix the actual problem, which is the hole in the legislation? So when I had the opportunity to begin speaking about my experiences publicly, I made that part of my policy reflections. And my local member, Jason Clare, heard me speak at an event and asked for more information about what had happened. And he took that to Parliament. And just in September, I mean, it's been ages, but just in September, he called me and said to me, oh, the law's been changed and now that loophole has been closed. So a wider range of circumstances can be looked at to prevent women having the same barrier, which is a huge win, I think.
It's a massive win, and honestly, hijab off to you for doing all of that hard work and really just paving the way for people in similar circumstances to be able to access that really, really important pay. Okay, I might start wrapping up so that we have time for questions. So I might just ask, what is your proudest moment so far as a writer? Tasnim, I might start with you, and I'd love to hear an example as well. Are you still on mute?
Oh my gosh, sorry. I did the fumble to unmute. That is a really good question, and I should have thought about it before you asked me, because you did send us these questions earlier. I think it's just every time someone's come up to me and said that they felt seen. I worked on a web series called Car Park Clubbing for ABC iView a couple of years ago, and it was just 3 girls sitting in a car park of a donut shop, gas bagging. Like, that was it. They were just hanging out, and they got doled up to go hang out in a car park. It was based on the experiences of the other co-writers who had spent time in the Krispy Kreme car park in Orange Grove, which is a thing, apparently. And, you know, the character that I wrote was Muslim, but also a bit obnoxious, grew up in a McMansion, was actually probably the most privileged of the three characters, went on a halal chaperone date with an NRMA guy. And someone messaged me and was like, I have never seen a Muslim woman be like the object of like someone else's attention or attraction. They were like, it's always, Muslim women are always victims. And so that's kind of what we wanted, like someone who's a bit of a pain and real and a little bit, yeah, like complex and funny. And that felt really great to be able to hear that, because, you know, we don't get to be nuanced, you know, we don't get to be complex, we don't get to be so many things that everyone else has the right to have. And so to be able to do that in like, you know, an 8-minute comedy was really, really nice to be able to get that feedback. And yeah, it's something that feels exciting, because you hope that it can continue to happen.
Absolutely, and that's really brilliant, and reminds me as well of Halal Girls, which I was involved in as a writer, and we put so much effort into making sure that the main character was not sexualized and orientalized, and you know, just
they have agency.
Exactly, that's exactly right. We wanted Mona, the main character, to have all the agency that we as Muslim women have in real life, because anytime we see Muslim women in film or television, yeah, they're always the victims. That's absolutely right. So it was important for the character to be really competitive and you know, just like snarky and witty and all of the things that is representative of real life. Bilal, what is your proudest moment so far?
My proudest moment as a writer is the teaching of writing. And I know, again, I'm slightly boring in saying this as an answer, but I think like the reason why I am a writer and the writer that I am is because I've been able to learn from people who are totally fantastic. People like you, Sara, and watching you perform and you operating in the world as a writer. So when I am at my proudest is not necessarily when I am creating and sharing work, although I have, you know, many examples where that has made me feel pride. It's when I get to teach writing. And there was one instance that I always think about, where I was working in juvenile justice with a young man who was 14. And we were writing about the first time he had ever had a Slurpee, the first time he ever went to a 7-Eleven and had a Slurpee. And I told him to tell me the story because we were trying to craft it together. And he was like, so I walked in, went to the person and I said, how much is a Slurpee? And he said, it's $1. So then I had the Slurpee and it was great. I'm like, oh, cool, really, really cool first draft of your story. Let's try to unpack this a little bit. And I remember over the course of like an hour-long session with him, we were trying to flesh out the like, what made him go to the 7-Eleven that day? What flavor was the Slurpee? What was his reaction? Did he have to kind of choose between different Slurpee flavors? What was his reasoning behind choosing that size of Slurpee? Can he describe the cashier a little bit more? Was he alone? Was there anyone else with him? And then I was asking him all these questions. And near the end, he was like, man, writing is really, really, really hard. Like writing stories is really hard. I'm like, it totally is. And then he just went, thanks. And then he put his head down and he wrote for 20 minutes. So it was like that moment that as a writer, I could share my experience of like, here's what I do with my craft. And here are all the things that you need to consider. And yes, it's hard, but this young 14-year-old incarcerated man was there sitting down and just going, this is really difficult for me, but it's important because this story is important for me. So I want to share it and I'm going to keep going. And I think moments like that are the times that I feel the most proud as a writer.
That's amazing.
What flavor Slurpee was it though?
Raspberry.
Good.
And I was like, best choice you could go for.
Yeah, I totally agree. And good on you.
Oh, sorry, wait. And then Tasnim, one extra thing I said to him was like, did you mix the flavors? And then he just went, you're allowed to do that? I was like, yes, absolutely.
I was going to say, Bilal, good on you for the really great work that you do in especially Western Sydney with young people and teaching them that they can mix Slurpee flavors. It's really important work. So
yeah. You don't learn that at uni.
No, you don't. No, this is real life stuff. Amani, what has been your proudest moment so far?
I just want to say that I haven't had a 7-Eleven Slurpee, so I might go and have one, and next book
Yeah.
will be on that.
Amani, if you need to workshop that scene,
book, I'm
just give me
ready.
a call. We can workshop it together. It'll be great.
My proudest moment, if I'm really, really honest, is probably publication of my book. There was like a lot of work that went into that. There was a lot of pain. It was a mentally grueling process. I wrote a significant chunk of it in lockdown last year with 2 kids like in my workspace. Seeing it on one of the shelves in Kmart like the other day, because we'd been in lockdown since it came out and hadn't seen it in the wild yet, was a really rewarding experience. And then the feedback that's come through from women who've read it has been incredible. Just people saying things like, I've never seen this particular aspect of my life represented. I never thought I'd read a book like this. There were so many things that you said that resonated with me. I found this really empowering, even though it was painful. That kind of feedback has been amazing, and it makes it all incredibly worthwhile.
Absolutely amazing. And anyone who hasn't read the book in this panel, I really, really strongly encourage you, to the point where I'll actually threaten you. You have to go.
I'm reading it. I was saying earlier before we went live. Yeah, I was reading till like 2 in the morning.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go check it out, everybody.
Yeah, it's phenomenal. Or if you don't have much free time like me, the audiobook is also really beautiful. It's narrated by Amani. And her voice is really soothing. So it was great to just have her in my ears for 10 hours. Okay, so we have time for some questions. The first question from Sara. So we're also writers on stolen land. So Sara would love to hear how that informs your identities and your practice as writers. So in other words, the ethics and responsibilities of storytelling. Bilal, I might start with you on that one.
Yeah.
Do you want me to repeat the question?
No, I've got it. Thank you for sharing it. And thank you, Sara, as well in the chat for asking it. This is one of those ones where, like, if you asked Bilal like 3, even 2 years ago, he's just like, most of those phrases, I don't even know what you're asking. Like, I'm still, as a writer, so new to all of this that there's no like class that you go to that teaches you how to navigate these things. But if I continue the theme of trying to answer it in the most raw way that I can, in the most honest way I can, is that as a writer and as someone who has been lucky enough to be taught how to write really well, and the way that I was taught, not necessarily how I am writing, I'm trying to be humble, but I feel a huge responsibility to share that knowledge with other early career writers. And I feel like that in the work that I do at the Story Factory, and also the work that I get to do with the Bankstown Poetry Slam, is that I am facilitating spaces where I can share that knowledge specifically with First Nations communities in Australia, and to be able to give them tools to tell the very important stories that they are needing to tell and wanting to tell. I think that is the best place that I can be in as an early career writer myself in Australia, that I am a conduit through which I can share knowledge that has traditionally been horribly inaccessible for communities that are under-resourced. So that if I can act as that connecting point to be like, these are the things you might want to consider yourself as a writer, I think that is one of the best things that I can do. And outside of that, I think poetry specifically has this long and beautiful history of having a spirit of protest. And you see that all across the world. And I try to embody that in my own writing that I do, that I try to call out kind of minority stories from my own perspective when I can and when I feel like it's appropriate, but then also as a facilitator and host of spaces to create environments where people who are having similar experiences, and again, more specifically and more importantly, First Nations writers, to enter into that space and be able to share their work as well.
Okay. We've got another question from Jemima. Where and how did you learn to write, Bilal?
There is a writer that's currently in this Zoom session that I'm going to embarrass. And he is one of my mentors as a writer. His name is Rico Craig. He wrote books like this. I promise I didn't prepare this on purpose. Hi, Alia. Hi, Amor. Nice to see you. This is his latest collection, Our Tongues Are Songs. So if you ever want to skill up on how to write poetry, He often does lots of sessions with Queensland Poetry Festival, and he also works at the Story Factory. So people like that who are really generous and patient with their time, and who can share their craft with you, and who approach your work without judgment. Again, harkening back to what Amani was talking about, where you can have someone mentor you through the process of writing without having an agenda, without being like, I'm trying to get you to share this political message, or I want you to like delve more into your trauma, do more of this. Rico has never done that before. And I feel like finding people like that is incredibly important. And he is a very, very good starting point, but so are people like Sara, so is Amani, so is Tasnim, all these fantastic writers. So if you've met them, they're people that you should continue to talk to.
Brilliant. Thank you, Bilal. Amani, so I'd love to hear from you about how the fact that we're writers on stolen land informs your identity and practice as a writer. And also someone's asked how we go about writing and ultimately publishing a book.
Yeah, thank you. I think those are both really important questions. I've, like a lot of people, gone through this journey of identity where I was brought up in an environment where the only valid experience or emotion that you can have for being on Australian land or on stolen land is gratitude. And having to learn more about truth and history and unlearn that that's the only thing that you can feel as someone who's from a family who migrated to Australia. I was born here and I was brought up with this very strong messaging about you've got to be a model migrant, you've got to be grateful and nothing else, and uncritical for being here. And I think now that I recognize the realities and I've learned to identify as a settler on unceded Aboriginal land, I think that has been incredibly enriching, because it also, you know, as someone who speaks and advocates in relation to topics like trauma and displacement, then how do I have that conversation in the fullest and most meaningful way if I'm not acknowledging the trauma and the displacement that has taken place on this land? So for me, it's about being real, about letting go of those pressures that are imposed on us as minorities, and of showing solidarity towards people who have had injustice committed against them and where injustice is ongoing. And I think that fits both within my understanding of my faith, my political perspectives, and my particular relationship with feminism, where I want to talk about the way that women experience all forms of injustice. And we know that Aboriginal women are overrepresented in the prison population. We know that Aboriginal women experience DV at disproportionate rates. And we know that Aboriginal women also then have to deal with the intergenerational trauma that is associated with our racist legacy. So for me, it's been about building my literacy originally about these issues that weren't there previously, and then incorporating that into my work and being more sensitive and growing my work. And I think that just makes it more powerful, and it puts me in a better position to learn more and to really benefit from especially the knowledge that Aboriginal women have to share in relation to women's health and safety.
Brilliant. And just going about writing and publishing a book, Amani, do you have any, can you give someone, the person that was asking, some guidance around that?
Yeah, so for me, it was about practicing, learning to pitch shorter pieces of writing to places like SBS Voices, learning to seek mentorship. So I was part of the Sweatshop Women Collective and learned a lot in that space, especially in relation to speaking about race as well as my experiences, because there's obviously an intersection in my life that I needed to grapple with. And just being open to feedback, being open to rejection, understanding that those things happen and they are part of the process. So I, you know, from just writing for myself to writing for outlets to putting together a manuscript was several years of self-guided learning and accessing mentoring and reading really broadly on the subjects that I was interested in. And I don't think there's one path to publication, but I was able to connect with an agent who I found really supportive and empowering, who encouraged me to tell the story in the way that I wanted to tell it. And my publishers, Pam Macmillan, then helped me refine my manuscript in a way that was, again, incredibly empowering, acknowledged my agency, acknowledged my craft, and gave me the opportunity I think what's really important is to have both your craft and your subject matter respected by the people that you're working with and the people that you're learning from. And that's what I've, luckily had in my experience. So I think it's a matter of sticking with it and, understanding that it's a non-linear process, and hopefully you'll get there.
Amazing. Thank you so much. That's really, really insightful. We probably don't have time for this question, but Tasnim, I'd like to direct this question to you from Denise. I identify as a Muslim woman, and like many people, I have multiple identities. I have so much anxiety writing about my personal experiences with my community. Example, Sunni, Alawi relations, LGBT issues. I'm worried that what I write could be twisted around, weaponized by white supremacy / Islamophobes, and used for furthering stereotypes. How do I go about writing my truth and come over this anxiety?
I think that that's a really good question, and it's a really real fear. I mean, I have that as well. I think I've worked through the worry about the community aunties and uncles, but yeah, the fact that words can be used to hurt our community from people outside. I think it's about what the reasons are. If it's to express what it is that's going on for you, then if it's honest, I think it should be allowed to be told, and who you want to communicate with and how. I think all of those things really matter, because if we've had experiences of feeling isolated or feeling anxious or, having these difficult experiences, there's someone else out there, usually multiple people out there, many who have experienced these same things. And so for us to be able to write about it and talk about it means that that person feels seen, feels less alone, feels connected, can potentially take something away from that. So I think it's a very real fear, and it's completely, and yeah, it happens, but also these structures exist to silence us. So staying silent just means that it's achieving its purpose. So I think that it's important to find the right people to speak to and the ways that work for you, and to tell those stories.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, speaking from personal experience, it can feel really daunting. But then when you put that piece of work out into the world, and then you have people connecting with you over it, and saying that it resonated with them, it's very, very empowering.
Yeah, I mean, Islamophobes will find whatever, I did a video last year cooking a Ramadan dish with my mum, and my mum is hilarious and charming and has like an excellent sense of fashion. And there was still people wishing ill to her. Yeah. And it's just like, I can't do anything about that. It's going to exist. But then there's so many other people who get to learn how to cook a Bangladeshi Ramadan dish. So why not?
Exactly. Like, you can't always win. And I think it's really important to not be scared of speaking your truth and putting your work out into the world, because 1% of people might not like it. Thank you all so very much. Round of applause. Thank you to Writing New South Wales as well, and to Zahra for bringing us all together, and for allowing us to have such a robust and interesting discussion. So thank you again, Bilal, Hafda, Amani, Haydar, Tasnim, Hossain. It was a pleasure. I can't think of a better way to spend a Saturday afternoon. And Alia also enjoyed her cameo. So thank you all so much. And
the true star.
And thank you as well to the participants, everyone that's come through, and for your wonderful comments and questions. Cool. So do we just go now?